Winter on the northern frontier did not arrive politely. It closed in. The wind found every weakness in fresh-cut timber. Snow crusted over cabin roofs overnight, hardening into ice before sunrise. The cold was so sharp that each breath left the body visible for a moment, hanging in the air before disappearing. In the late 19th century, in the high, wind-scoured settlements of the American frontier, winter was not a season. It was a trial of survival. These settlers were not fragile people. They knew how to build. They knew how to cut trees, split logs, and raise cabins with their own hands. They believed in work, in endurance, and above all, in fire. Every cabin followed the same logic: squared log walls, a stone fireplace in the corner, a chimney reaching into the gray sky. Smoke rose constantly during daylight. At night, fires were fed every few hours, no matter how exhausted the hands that carried the wood. But the cold did not respect effort. Even with flames roaring, warmth drifted upward, pooled uselessly near the ceiling, and vanished through the roof. Floors stayed bitterly cold. Drafts crept through door frames, window seams, and cracks too small to see but large enough for winter to enter. Children slept curled into themselves. Older men stayed awake through the darkest hours, afraid to let the fire die. Strong backs grew weaker as nights passed without rest. Cabin after cabin shared the same struggle. A whole community bound by a single belief. Fire was the only defense against winter. So they fought harder. They burned more wood. They worked longer days just to survive the nights. And still, the cold kept winning. Yet something unsettled the rhythm of that suffering. In one modest cabin, during the coldest nights, there was no frantic movement at midnight. No figure hunched beside dying coals. No door thrown open to haul in more firewood against the wind. When morning came, the man who lived there stepped outside looking rested. His hands steady. His shoulders relaxed. His eyes clear. His name was Elias Holmgren. Elias was not wealthier than the others. His cabin was no larger. His fireplace no grander. But while his neighbors spoke of frozen floors and sleepless nights, Elias listened quietly. While they counted the cords of wood disappearing from their stacks, he said little. That difference bred unease. Not because Elias boasted, he never did, but because he had not built the way they had. While others raised walls higher and sealed cracks tighter, Elias had spent much of the summer doing something that made no sense to them. He had dug, not a well, not a cellar for food, but a deep, deliberate space beneath where his cabin floor would be. Men laughed. Some shook their heads. They said it was the habit of old countries, of poor people, of those who hadn't learned that America was about building upward, not burrowing like animals. Progress, they believed, rose above the ground. Winter had no opinion about progress. It only cared about temperature. And as the nights grew longer, as wind scoured the land and the cold settled deeper into bone and timber, a quiet question began to form among the exhausted settlers. Why does Elias sleep while the rest of us endure? Why does he greet the morning without fear of the night before? The answer was not in his fire, not in his strength, not in his willpower. It was beneath their feet. And that is where this story truly begins. Elias Holmgren did not argue with his neighbors. He did not explain himself. When others were staking corners and raising walls, Elias marked the ground beneath his future cabin and put a shovel into the soil. At first, it looked like preparation for a simple root cellar, common enough on the frontier. But as the days passed, the hole grew deeper, and deeper still. Topsoil gave way to dense clay, then to packed earth that had not seen daylight for thousands of years. Men stopped by on their way to the river or the saw pit. They leaned on their tools and watched him work. Some joked. Some offered advice he didn't ask for. Most shook their heads. "You're wasting good summer light," one man said. "Build your walls first," said another. "A man sleeps above ground," someone laughed. "That's the whole point of a cabin." Elias listened. He nodded politely. Then he kept digging. By midsummer, the hole was deep enough that a man standing inside it could barely see the sky. The work was slow and heavy. Every shovel load had to be hauled up by hand. Sweat soaked his shirt even on cool mornings. Still, he worked steadily, measuring depth not by guesswork, but by intention. To the community, it looked like backward thinking. This was a time when frontier settlements were trying to look permanent. People wanted cabins that resembled towns back east. Straight lines, visible strength, chimneys tall enough to announce stability. Digging into the ground felt like an admission of weakness, like retreating into the earth instead of claiming it. But Elias had learned something different long before he ever reached this place. As a younger man, he had traveled through mountain country where winter arrived early and stayed late. He had hunted where wind stripped heat from the body faster than fire could replace it. He had slept in crude shelters carved into hillsides, tucked against stone, wrapped in earth. Those nights were not luxurious, but they were calm, predictable. The cold stayed outside. While others trusted what could be seen, thick walls, roaring flames, Elias trusted what could not. By late summer, he began hauling stone. Smooth, rounded pieces pulled from riverbeds and old glacial deposits. He carried them one by one, lowering them carefully into the pit. People gathered again, more curious now than mocking. Building a well, someone asked. Burying treasure, another joked. Elias didn't answer. He set each stone with care, fitting weight against weight, lining the earth not for decoration, but for purpose. This was not a hole meant to collapse or rot. It was something intended to last. As autumn approached, his cabin finally began to rise above ground. To the casual eye, it looked ordinary. Same size, same logs, same fireplace placement. Nothing about it explained why he had spent so much time below the surface. Except for one thing. In the floor, near the back wall, Elias left an opening. Covered, insulated, quiet. Beneath it, a ladder descended into darkness. That was when the talk changed. Some said he was inviting sickness. Others said damp air would ruin him. A few insisted he would abandon the idea the first cold night, seal the opening, and sleep like everyone else, by the fire half awake, guarding the coals. Elias heard all of it, and still he said nothing, because he wasn't trying to prove a point. He was preparing for winter. Not the kind that tests pride, but the kind that reveals which ideas were strong enough to survive when the temperature fell and excuses ran out. And when the first hard frosts came, Elias was already finished. Elias Holmgren never claimed to invent anything. He was not chasing a new idea. He was remembering an old one. While others spoke of winter as an enemy to be beaten back, Elias watched how the land itself behaved when the cold arrived. He noticed what did not freeze as quickly, what did not panic, what remained steady while everything else changed. Streams crusted over at the surface, yet flowed freely beneath. Wells never sealed shut with ice. Root cellars kept potatoes firm when cabins above them dropped below freezing. Even on the coldest mornings, the earth itself felt calm. Animals understood this without explanation. Foxes disappeared underground. Badgers vanished into slopes. Bears surrendered to the ground for months at a time, trusting soil and stone to hold what the air could not. They did not fight winter with heat. They stepped out of its reach. Elias had seen the same truth far from this settlement. In high mountain camps, hunters carved shallow shelters into south-facing hillsides, stacking stone at their backs, packing earth overhead. No roaring fires. No constant feeding of flames. Just stillness. The cold stayed outside. Sleep came easily. Back then, no one had spoken of thermal mass or ground temperature. They spoke of comfort, of how the body rested better when the world around it did not steal heat every second. Elias carried that memory with him across oceans and plains. Here, on the frontier, people had forgotten. They believed walls stopped cold. They believed fire conquered winter. They believed progress meant standing taller against the elements. Elias had learned something quieter. The ground does not argue with the weather. As fall deepened, he tested his space. Not during a storm. Not during hardship. On calm, cool nights when others slept easily, Elias descended the ladder and lay beneath the earth. He listened. No wind. No shifting temperatures. Just silence and a steady, even chill that never sharpened into pain. He noted how his breath did not fog the air. How the stone around him felt neither warm nor cold, but neutral. How a single wool blanket was enough, even when the cabin above dipped into discomfort before dawn. This was not comfort born of luxury. It was comfort born of stability. What Elias understood, though he never explained it in numbers, was that winter exhausts people not through cold alone, but through fluctuation. Warm, then cold. Cold, then colder. Fire roaring, then dying. The human body is forced to adapt again and again, burning energy simply to stay alive. Below the surface, that struggle disappears. The earth does not spike. It does not collapse. It does not drain heat away at the speed of wind. It holds its temperature like a memory, slow to change, patient beyond human time. As others prepared for winter by stacking wood higher and sharpening axes, Elias prepared by sealing gaps, adjusting airflow, and protecting the only place where heat truly mattered, where a man slept. To the community, his behavior still looked strange. Too calm, too unconcerned. They mistook his silence for ignorance. But Elias was not ignoring winter. He was studying it. And when the real cold arrived, the kind that strips sleep from men and strength from families, those quiet observations would matter far more than anyone yet understood. What Elias Holmgren understood was not superstition. It was not luck. And it was not stubbornness. It was physics, simple enough to be felt long before it was ever written down. Above ground, winter rules by extremes. Day and night, wind and calm, fire and ash. The temperature of the air changes constantly, sometimes by dozens of degrees in a single night. Every wall exposed to that air becomes a battlefield where heat is lost second by second. But the ground does not live in that world. Below the frost line, the earth holds a steady temperature year-round, governed not by the weather of the moment, but by the average climate of the region. In much of the northern frontier, that meant soil and stone stayed cool in summer and mild in winter, often hovering in the low to mid-40s Fahrenheit, even when the air above plunged far below zero. This was not theory. It was everyday knowledge to anyone who dug deep enough. Wells never froze solid. Root cellars protected food through the harshest months. Spring houses kept milk from spoiling long before iceboxes existed. The earth absorbed heat slowly and released it just as slowly, smoothing out the violence of seasonal change. What Elias did differently was place himself inside that stability. The space beneath his cabin was not just a hole. It was surrounded by packed soil on nearly every side. Tons of earth pressed in close, forming a natural barrier that wind could not penetrate and cold could not rush through. Where the ground met the walls, stone reinforced that mass, adding weight, density, and thermal memory. Stone does not heat quickly, but once it reaches equilibrium, it resists change. It absorbs warmth during the day and releases it gently through the night. Not as bursts of heat, but as consistency. Above this chamber, Elias insulated carefully. He understood that insulation does not create warmth, it prevents its escape. Dry materials trapped air. Air slowed heat loss. And when heat had nowhere to go, it stayed. This was the difference no one else was considering. Most frontier cabins fought winter by producing more heat. Larger fires, thicker flames, constant feeding. Elias reduced the fight itself. He placed his body where heat loss slowed to a crawl. There was also another factor. One modern engineers would later name, but that Elias felt instinctively. Comfort is not determined by air temperature alone. It is shaped by the surfaces around you. Cold walls steal heat from the body, even when the air feels tolerable. Warm surfaces return it. This is why a poorly insulated room feels cold at 68 degrees, while a stone room at 55 can feel restful. In the chamber beneath his cabin, every surface settled into the same narrow range of temperature. Stone walls, earthen floor, timber ceiling above insulation. Nothing pulled heat aggressively from his body. Nothing shocked his skin with cold. He was not warming the space. The space was no longer draining him. To his neighbors, this way of thinking felt backward. They measured comfort by how high the fire burned. Elias measured it by how little heat he lost while sleeping. Two approaches. One burned forests. The other trusted the ground. When winter tightened its grip and the air turned cruel, the difference between those ideas would no longer be theoretical. It would be measurable, in wood saved, in sleep preserved, and in strength carried forward into the next day. And soon, everyone would notice. What Elias Holmgren built beneath his cabin was not a shelter of desperation. It was not a cave, and it was certainly not an accident. It was a system, assembled with the same care a good craftsman gave to a roof or a hearth. Depth came first. Elias did not stop digging when it became uncomfortable. He stopped only when he reached soil that no longer responded to the weather above. This mattered more than most people realized. Too shallow, and the ground still followed winter's mood swings. Deep enough, and the temperature settled into quiet consistency. Then came stone, not stacked randomly, but placed with intention. Smooth river stones and dense field rock lined the walls, fitted tight, their weight pressing firmly against the earth. Stone served two purposes at once. It prevented collapse, and it held temperature. Once cooled or warmed, It resisted change, acting as a buffer between the human body and the restless air above. Above the chamber, Elias focused on the only vulnerable surface, the ceiling. This was where heat could escape upward. He sealed it carefully with dry insulating material packed thick beneath the floorboards. Nothing damp, nothing loose. Air trapped in still layers, slowing the movement of warmth until it almost stopped. Ventilation mattered too. Stagnant air ruins even the best shelter. Elias allowed the chamber to breathe, not through drafts, but through gentle exchange. Warm air from above encouraged slow circulation. Enough oxygen to remain healthy. Not enough movement to steal heat. Everything served a purpose. The goal was never to make the chamber warm. The goal was to make it stable. Frontier cabins failed not because they lacked fire, but because they leaked energy constantly. Every crack, every gust of wind, every cold wall forced the body to work harder just to maintain itself. Elias removed that struggle where it mattered most, during sleep. At night, when the body is most vulnerable. When energy must be conserved rather than burned, his system reduced loss to nearly nothing. The earth pressed close on all sides. The stone moderated change. Insulation sealed the only escape. Ventilation remained controlled and calm. This was not comfort born of luxury. It was comfort born of engineering without equations. Others believed survival meant overpowering winter. Elias designed a space where winter simply could not reach. And when the true cold arrived, when fires failed, when axes dulled, when exhaustion set in, this quiet system beneath the cabin would reveal its value in a way no argument ever could. The real test did not come gradually. It arrived all at once. The wind shifted just after sunset, sharp and deliberate, stripping the last warmth from the day. By nightfall, the sky had cleared to a hard, star-filled black, the kind that always came before the deepest cold. Thermometers in the settlement, few as they were, dropped steadily, then faster still. Cabin doors were barred. Fires were fed heavily. Men calculated how much would they could afford to burn before dawn. Inside the cabins, heat rose and vanished. Flames roared, yet the air near the floor stayed bitter. Boots froze solid by the door. Water buckets formed skins of ice. Families slept in shifts, waking to stir coals before the fire collapsed completely. No one slept deeply. Elias Holmgren followed the same routine he always did. As evening settled in, he banked his fire, not high, not desperate, just enough to keep the main room livable through the night. He checked the door seals. He listened to the wind. Then, without urgency, he opened the covered hatch in his floor and descended the ladder. The air changed immediately. Below the cabin, there was no howl of wind, no creaking timbers, no sharp edge to the cold. The space held its temperature without effort, as it had every night since autumn. Stone walls stood silent and unmoving. The earth pressed close, indifferent to the storm above. Elias closed the insulated cover behind him and lay down. Above ground, the cold tightened its grip. The fire in his cabin burned down to coals before morning, the room temperature dropping steadily. Frost crept along the inside edges of the logs. In other cabins, men rose again and again, burning through wood they could not replace. By the deepest hours of the night, the air outside had fallen to levels few could endure without fire. Breath crystallized instantly. Wood cracked under tension. The land itself seemed to shrink. Below the surface, nothing changed. Elias slept through the night beneath a single wool blanket. His body did not fight to stay warm. His breath stayed slow and even. The stone around him neither chilled nor warmed, but simply remained. While the settlement battled winter in shifts of exhaustion, Elias rested. When dawn finally came, thin, pale, reluctant, men stepped outside hollow-eyed, shoulders tight from cold and sleeplessness. Fires had eaten through stacks of wood. Strength had been spent just surviving the night. Elias emerged from his cabin quietly, moving without stiffness, his energy intact. No one said anything at first, but everyone noticed. That night had taken something from every man in the settlement, except one. And in the silence that followed, it became clear that winter had not judged them by effort or pride. It had judged them by design. And Elias Holmgren had passed the test. The morning after the coldest night did not begin with celebration. It began with silence. Men stepped out of their cabins stiff and hollow-eyed, moving slowly as if their joints had aged overnight. Ash buckets were full. Wood piles were smaller. Faces that once carried confidence now showed calculation and concern. Winter was no longer an abstract threat. It had made its terms clear. Elias Holmgren emerged later than most. Not because he had struggled through the night, but because he had slept. His movements were unhurried, his breath steady. He did not rush to rebuild the fire or stamp warmth back into his feet. That was when someone finally asked the question no one could ignore. How was it? Not mocking, not joking, just honest. Elias paused, considering the answer as if choosing his words carefully. Steady, he said. Didn't change much. There was no boasting in his voice, no satisfaction, just a statement of fact. A few men exchanged looks. One of them stepped closer, eyes narrowing not in suspicion, but in disbelief. Fires had burned all night across the settlement. Wood had vanished into smoke. And still, no one else could say the same. Another question followed. What was it like down there? Elias gestured toward the ground beneath his cabin. Quiet. Same as always. That was when the tone shifted. No one argued. No one laughed. Winter had stripped away pride and replaced it with clarity. When survival is at stake, theories matter less than outcomes. By midday, men began stopping by Elias's cabin, not to mock, but to observe. They noticed how little wood he had burned, how his firebox held ash instead of coals fought into exhaustion, how he moved through the day without the dullness that followed sleepless cold. Someone asked to see it. Elias hesitated only long enough to consider the request. Then he lifted the hatch. One by one, men descended the ladder, their expressions changing as the air shifted around them. Shoulders loosened. Breathing slowed. Heavy coats were unbuttoned without thought. No one spoke at first. There was nothing dramatic to see. No flames. No glowing stones. No miracle. Just a space that refused to be cold. When they climbed back up, the change in their faces said everything words could not. Years of habit had told them winter must be fought. Elias had shown them it could be avoided. By evening, conversations spread quietly through the settlement. Not rumors. Not exaggerations. Just measured observations passed from man to man. He slept through it. Used hardly any wood. It's not damp. It's warmer than my cabin with a fire going. No speeches were needed. No debates followed. The cold had already delivered its verdict. Elias Holmgren had not won an argument. He had survived a night others barely endured. And on the frontier, that was the only proof that ever mattered. Understanding did not spread all at once. It moved the way good ideas always do, slowly, unevenly, shaped by need. Not every family could dig as deep as Elias had. Some lacked the strength, others the time. A few lived on ground too rocky or too shallow for the same approach. But winter does not demand perfection. It rewards adaptation. The first to modify the idea were families with many children. They did not build a single chamber, but smaller sleeping spaces beneath raised platforms, using stone and packed earth where they could, and thick layers of insulation where they could not. The goal remained the same: reduce exposure, conserve body heat, protect sleep. Older settlers took a different path. Too stiff to dig deep pits. They built partially sunken enclosures inside their cabins, stone-backed sleeping alcoves with earth packed around the outside walls. Not fully underground, but shielded enough to escape the worst fluctuations of night air. The results were modest, but real. Fewer sleepless hours. Less wood burned. Less strain on aging bodies. Some experimented boldly. One man excavated only a shallow depth, then built upward, stacking stone and soil around a timber-framed sleeping chamber until it sat half-buried like a low hill inside his cabin. The earth did the same work regardless of direction. Stability came not from depth alone, but from mass. Mistakes were made. A few dug too shallow and found the cold still creeping in. Others sealed spaces too tightly, forgetting that air must move, even in winter. Those chambers were abandoned or rebuilt. Frontier learning was always paid for an effort. But where the principles were followed, depth where possible, stone for weight, insulation above, controlled airflow, the pattern repeated. Nights grew easier. Wood piles lasted longer. Mornings began with strength instead of dread. No two designs looked the same. And that was the point. Elias never claimed there was a single correct way. He shared principles, not instructions. The land, the soil, the stone available, all of it mattered. Each family shaped the idea to their own conditions. This was frontier intelligence at its best. Not copying blindly, not clinging to tradition, but observing what worked and reshaping it to survive. By the time winter loosened its grip, the settlement had changed. Not in appearance, but in understanding. They no longer saw the ground as something beneath them. They saw it as something that could support them. And the idea did not stop there. Travelers carried the story outward, not as legend, but as a practical lesson learned the hard way. In places where winter punished excess and rewarded restraint, people listened. Elias Holmgren had not built a monument. He had started a quiet evolution, one that spread not because it was clever, but because it worked. What unfolded in that small settlement was not an anomaly. It was a rediscovery. Elias Holmgren's solution felt radical only because the frontier had forgotten a truth that much of humanity once understood instinctively. When fuel is scarce and winters are cruel, the earth itself becomes shelter. Long before log cabins dotted North America, people across the world learned to step out of the wind rather than fight it. In the American Southwest, ancestral communities built pit houses and earth-sheltered dwellings that stayed cool under desert sun and warm through cold nights. Their homes did not rely on fire to dominate the air. They relied on mass, depth, and protection from extremes. Even ceremonial spaces were sunk into the ground, not hidden in shame, but placed deliberately where temperature remained steady. Across the Pacific, families in Korea warmed their homes with the ondol system, stone floors built over low channels that carried heat from a single small fire. The stone absorbed warmth slowly, then released it through the night. The air could cool. The surfaces stayed kind to the body. Sleep came easily. Farther north, where timber was scarce and winters unforgiving, people built turf houses, walls of stone and earth capped with thick sod roofs. These homes blended into the landscape, nearly invisible beneath grass and soil. They were not signs of poverty. They were signs of understanding. Even the Inuit, facing cold far beyond anything the frontier endured, knew that survival was not about overpowering winter. Snow itself became insulation. An igloo, warmed only by body heat and a small flame, could hold temperatures that would shock anyone unfamiliar with its design. The principle was always the same: trap still air, reduce exposure, eliminate rapid heat loss. What Elias did in the late 19th century followed this ancient logic exactly. The irony was not lost on those who thought about it long enough. Many settlers had come from regions where earth-sheltered living was once common. Yet in their pursuit of a new identity, they rejected what looked old, even when it worked better than anything they replaced it with. The frontier was caught between worlds. Industrial tools had arrived. Cast iron stoves promised mastery over winter. Milled lumber made cabins faster to build. Chimneys grew taller. Fires burned hotter. But insulation was poor. Fuel was finite. And the knowledge that once balanced these limitations had been left behind. Elias did not reject progress. He completed it. He used modern tools, saws, mortars, shaped timbers, to apply wisdom far older than the nation he now lived in. He bridged a gap that many could not yet see. The space between brute force heating and true thermal design, seen in that light. His underground sleeping chamber was not a strange invention of the frontier. It was part of a global lineage of human survival, one that surfaced again and again wherever people faced cold with limited resources and clear thinking. The land had always offered protection. The mistake was forgetting to accept it. And as the settlement absorbed this realization, the story of one man's quiet winter comfort began to feel less like a local curiosity, and more like a reminder that civilization advances not only by inventing new tools, but by remembering which old ones still work. The question was no longer whether Elias Holmgren's method worked. Winter had answered that. The deeper question was why so few had ever considered it in the first place. The late frontier existed in a narrow moment of history, balanced between scarcity and abundance, between old knowledge and new confidence. Industrial tools had arrived just early enough to change expectations, but not early enough to solve the problems they promised to eliminate. Cast iron stoves gave the illusion of control. Tall chimneys suggested progress. Straight walls and square corners looked permanent, modern, civilized. A roaring fire became a symbol, not just of warmth, but of success. What those symbols concealed was inefficiency. Log cabins leaked heat constantly. Wind slipped through seams. Cold surfaces drained warmth from the body, no matter how fiercely the fire burned. People responded by burning more wood, mistaking effort for effectiveness. Forests shrank. Axes dulled. Bodies wore down. And still, the nights remained cold. In rejecting earth-sheltered living, settlers were not acting out of ignorance alone. They were acting out of identity. Sleeping above ground felt like advancement. Burrowing felt like poverty. The techniques that once kept families alive were dismissed as relics of harder times, times they believed they had left behind. But belief does not change physics. The frontier had not yet gained what modern buildings would later rely on: high-performance insulation, airtight construction, controlled ventilation, and cheap, endless energy. Without those, the new style of building was incomplete, an idea halfway realized. Elias saw that gap clearly. He understood that progress is not linear. It stumbles. It discards valuable solutions in its rush forward. And sometimes survival depends on reaching backward, not to retreat, but to recover what was lost. The mockery he endured revealed something uncomfortable. People often confuse appearance with function. A structure that looks advanced is assumed to perform better. A method that looks primitive is assumed to be inferior. Winter exposed that illusion. A cabin blazing with fire but bleeding heat was not progress. It was waste disguised as modernity. Elias's quiet chamber beneath the floor was not backward. It was efficient. The frontier learned this lesson slowly, as most societies do. Only after discomfort becomes undeniable do people question assumptions they once held with certainty. This pattern repeats far beyond one settlement or one winter. Again and again, civilizations abandon methods that work because they no longer align with how progress is supposed to look. They trade reliability for spectacle, efficiency for convenience, wisdom for confidence. Elias Holmgren did not challenge winter with pride. He challenged it with humility. And in doing so, he revealed a truth the frontier was not yet ready to hear. Sometimes the most advanced solution is not the newest one, but the one that listens most closely to how the world actually works. What Elias Holmgren demonstrated was never meant to stay in the past. Its value was simply buried there, waiting. Modern life has taught us to expect warmth at the flip of a switch. Electricity flows. Fuel arrives on schedule. Thermostats respond instantly. For decades, that abundance made efficiency feel optional. Heat became cheap, invisible, and easy to waste. Until it wasn't. Power outages remind us how fragile comfort can be. Rising fuel costs expose how dependent warmth has become on distant systems. Storms, grid failures, and isolation return the same question frontier settlers once faced. How do you stay warm when supply is uncertain? The answer Elias lived by still applies. Modern off-grid builders are rediscovering what the frontier proved under pressure, not by copying old structures blindly, but by applying the same principles with better tools and safer standards. Earth-sheltered bedrooms, bermed homes, thick thermal mass walls paired with modern insulation, sleeping spaces designed for stability rather than heat output. The goal has shifted again, from heating entire buildings to protecting human comfort efficiently. Science now explains what Elias felt intuitively. The human body gives off a steady amount of heat. When that heat is not stripped away by cold surfaces or moving air, comfort follows naturally. Reducing loss matters more than increasing production. In practical terms, this means smaller, well-protected sleeping zones outperform large, poorly insulated living spaces. It means prioritizing insulation where the body rests. It means understanding that comfort is not about how hot the air feels at noon, but how little energy is required to sleep well at midnight. None of this requires rejecting modern life. It requires completing it. The most resilient designs today combine old wisdom with new knowledge. Engineers model thermal mass. Builders calculate dew points and ventilation rates. Codes ensure safety. The principles remain unchanged, only refined. What Elias offered was not nostalgia. It was resilience, a way of thinking that asks fewer resources to do more work, a design philosophy that respects limits rather than fighting them. In a world where energy certainty can no longer be taken for granted, those ideas feel less like history and more like preparation. Winter has not grown kinder. It has only become quieter about its demands. And those who listen, who design for stability instead of excess, discover what Elias did long ago. True comfort is not something you chase with fuel. It is something you build into the ground beneath you. In the end, Elias Holmgren did not change his world with noise. He did it with stillness. Long after that winter loosened its grip, after the snow receded and the ground softened, his His cabin looked no different from the others. The chimney still stood. The walls still weathered. Nothing about it announced innovation. Nothing demanded attention. And yet, beneath the floor, the earth remained exactly as it had been through the coldest nights, steady, patient, unchanged. That was the lesson winter delivered, not just to one settlement, but to anyone willing to listen. The warmest place in winter is not where the fire burns brightest. Fire is restless. It consumes. It demands constant labor. Miss a moment, and it fades. The earth asks for nothing. It does not roar or glow. It simply holds its temperature, quietly offering stability to those humble enough to accept it. Frontier wisdom was never about conquering nature. That was a story people told themselves to feel brave. Real survival came from observation, from noticing what endured without effort, from choosing cooperation over resistance. Elias understood that sleep was sacred, that rest preserved judgment, strength, and health far better than any extra armload of wood. He protected the one place where a man recovered from winter instead of fighting it. In doing so, he reminded others of something older than any nation. Human progress has never been a straight climb upward. It moves in circles. Knowledge is learned, forgotten, and learned again, each time shaped by new conditions. The earth does not mind being forgotten. It waits. Stone does not complain when ignored. Soil does not demand recognition. They remain, doing what they have always done. When energy is scarce, when systems fail, when winter presses in without apology, the same truths return. Stability matters more than intensity. Design matters more than effort. And comfort comes not from force, but from alignment with the world as it is. Elias Holmgren never called himself an innovator. He would not have recognized the word. He simply remembered something worth keeping, and applied it when it mattered most. The earth beneath his cabin did the rest, and it will be there long after fires burn out, waiting for the next generation to remember that sometimes the safest way forward is not higher, louder, or brighter, but deeper, quieter, and wisely grounded.